Dacyn is the Conservation Projects Manager at the Stanley Park Ecology Society. That society is otherwise known as SPES. Dacyn grew up in Calgary, Alberta, and moved to Vancouver to attend the University of British Columbia and complete a Bachelor of Science in Biology with an emphasis on ecology. Dacyn has experience working in the fields of conservation, habitat restoration, and environmental consulting through past employment in both the private and public sectors. At SPES, he is responsible for overseeing the conservation department, including organizing, co-leading, and assisting with wildlife surveys and monitoring, developing survey methodology, data collection and analysis, and reporting on key measurements to the Vancouver Park Board. He is also responsible for overseeing SPES's stewardship activities in Stanley Park, including developing programming, carrying out invasive plant removal and native plant restoration, and promoting a science-based approach to invasive species management within the park. He also assists with programming for coexistence between people and wildlife within the park, most specifically with urban coyotes. Dacyn is a keen botanist with a passion for all things plants. Please give a warm welcome to Dacyn Holinda.
Okay, excellent. So today I'm going to be basically giving you guys an overview of the history and the ecological challenges faced by Stanley Park. A pretty novel ecosystem, given that it exists within an urban park centered right in downtown. And so there's some interesting kind of challenges that arise from this, from a historical perspective, from current management perspectives, but there's also a lot of cool plants and different animals that we'll be able to see today. I'm mostly going to be focusing on plants, but I'll go over some animals as well. So let's jump right in. Just going to move the screen here. Excellent. Okay, so SPES is a nonprofit organization which promotes awareness and respect for the natural world and plays a leadership role in stewardship of Stanley Park through collaborative initiatives in education, research, and conservation. So my role at the my role at the Stanley Park Ecology Society is the Conservation Projects Manager. So under my purview, I kind of have three sub-departments: conservation, which mostly focuses on research. We have stewardship, which focuses mostly on native plant restoration, habitat enhancement, specifically in relation to plants, and then the urban wildlife sub-department, which focuses mostly through our Coexisting with Coyotes program. So we kind of cover a wide array within the park and kind of in the greater mainland as a whole. To start, so I would just like to do a little bit of a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that the lands that we're on today are the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. While I give this presentation, I would say it's kind of important to contextualize that a lot of these challenges that we're facing began as a result of colonization and the input of European settlers, and much of the invasive species, things like this, have been brought over by us. And a lot of what we're learning now, in particular in relation to stewardship, is using Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous perspectives to kind of help us with modern challenges. And so as we're going through today, it's important to keep that in mind and kind of put some context behind not only the place that is Stanley Park, but also the stewardship initiatives and all these challenges that we're facing. So a little bit about the Stanley Park Ecology Society. Our vision is of generations inspired by nature within and beyond Stanley Park. So we have been a registered charity, since 1988. We began as the Zoological Society, and we changed names with the closing of the zoo in 1995. So I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with that, but back in the day, there was a zoo in Stanley Park. You can even see the remnants today of where the old polar bear enclosure was. So we worked back then. Since 1997, we hold a joint operating agreement with the Vancouver Park Board. So our mandate essentially focuses on education, conservation, and research within the park, as I already mentioned. The Vancouver Park Board focuses on the management and strategic implementation. So a lot of what we're doing is providing recommendations, providing research, which is then shared with the Vancouver Parks Board so they can help make management decisions for the park itself. We also do some on-the-ground physical work as well, and that's mostly through our stewardship programs. I'll get into that a little bit more later, but we do hold stewardship weekly on a tri-weekly basis, as well as on the weekends. We actually just finished another planting event today. We've done almost 1,400 plants this season. We're going to aim to get 1,700 in the ground before the end of the year. And as I mentioned as well, we do play a bit of an advisory role, particularly in relation to urban wildlife in the park, but also in relation to stewardship management, kind of what we're seeing on the ground. We can be a bit of the eyes and the ears, so to speak, for the Parks Board in some context. So we're here today to talk about Beaver Lake. It's a 1 kilometer loop trail. Many of you have probably been there. It's a highly popular trail. I believe traffic into Stanley Park is estimated in the millions every year. So it's a dense number of visitors come to the park each year. So you can imagine lots of activity on that trail. It's accessible by both the seawall and pipeline road as well. So big attraction for tourists, big attraction for residents of the city. It's frequently used, as I mentioned. And it's quite unique as a space because you're getting a lot of different kind of novel ecosystems in one small area, especially right next to downtown. It's connected to the nearby Beaver Creek, which you can kind of see along Ravine Trail there in the red. I'll do my best to point, but for the Zoom people at home, I'll try to annotate as well. But yeah, you can see it running along, and the other blue that you can see are some of the other tributaries that feed in to Beaver Lake. So one of note is North Creek that you can see up there. That leads into Beaver Lake as well. So there's a couple other tributaries that exist around. The lake itself? Sure. The creek, oh sorry, so the creek, so we have Beaver Creek that runs parallel with Ravine Trail up here. You can see North Creek Trail. Luckily the trails are named after the creeks, which is helpful, along this line up here. So this cuts all the way up very close to the bridge there. Partially, yes. And of course, it's home to a wide variety of different wildlife, native plants, and of course, introduced species. So to start, we'll kind of go way back to give you some context. When we think about Beaver Lake, and especially in terms of its ecological challenges, we need to kind of look back to the origins. So it was a shallow marine lagoon that formed about 10,000 years ago with the recession of that Cordilleran ice sheet. You can see kind of in Vancouver here, during this period, Vancouver existed a little bit higher than sea level at the time, so it became a partial refuge. But during this time, it rose approximately 130 meters in 2,000 years. So it raises up, we get the shallow marine that forms, the shallow lagoon, sorry, and then we start getting a conversion into this bog. So we started off with a barren dry bog. Over time, obviously as the ice sheet recedes, as we get sea level rise, as we get all these other factors, we start moving into a forested bog, and it slowly becomes a freshwater pond. An interesting point to note as well, it's very different obviously than today, and that's due to the different conditions. So the landmass of BC rebounded much faster than any other post-glacial region in the world. That's why we saw the establishment of these types of bogs and then initially these lake systems. I want to touch on some Indigenous history as well. So as well, hopefully most of us know, Stanley Park was inhabited by the different host nations in Vancouver, particularly the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam, as I had previously mentioned. And I just wanted to highlight that Beaver Lake has played a significant cultural and historical value to the Indigenous peoples who utilized these lands. A particular note, there's the village of Hoi Hoi. I apologize if I pronounced that improperly. That was located near the eastern peninsula of the park. The village was named for a mass ceremony, so the best translation, as far as I understand it, is mass dance performance. And roughly 100 people lived in Hoi Hoi, and Beaver Lake was a significant source of cultural plant harvesting, foraging, and fishing for these people. Another particularly prominent settlement was Chaithus, which sits on modern-day Prospect Point, so at the northern portion of the park, and Chaithus itself means high bank. So you can see from the historical photos here, it looks vastly different than it does today in some sections. But it's important, as I mentioned, to keep in context that this area has been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years. As far as recent history goes, after we have colonization, we'll talk a lot about what happened. So in the 1860s, the watershed was selectively logged. We noted that Stanley Park becomes a park in 1888. And then in 1911, the perimeter trail and outflow weir were installed. So the trail itself around that lake was built. In 1916, municipal water supply to the lake began with the construction of a fish hatchery by the Vancouver Angling Society. I believe they were mostly focusing on trout, but I've also heard conflicting things that there might have been salmon as well. But kind of interesting to think about, especially today when we compare the differences, and I'll be going over some of the issues, especially pertaining to water quality. But at one time, it was a hatchery. In 1929, about 100,000 cubic feet of material were dredged from the lake. This is kind of interesting to note, right, when we go back to 1929, that this was still something that they were discussing back then as a problem. They were seeing succession and progression of the lake slowly turning more into a marsh wetland type habitat, so a significant amount was dredged. This is the number that's given in the reports. I will say with the caveat, a lot of the recent studies that have been done call into question this number somewhat. They think it's probably somewhere closer to I think the number I've heard was around 3,000, 3 to 6,000, because 100,000 cubic feet would correlate to a much larger hectare size than the lake itself. So it probably wasn't that, but that's what's been recorded. And then in 1937, we had the introduction of the invasive fragrant water lilies. So if you've ever been to Beaver Lake, it's probably one of the first things you will notice, these very beautiful flowers that sit on top of the lake. I'll be talking about them quite extensively today, so I'll hold off on that for now. And then in 1938, there was an engineering study that found that the area and volume of the lake was still decreasing, and that the building of the causeway that runs through Stanley Park divided the watershed in half. So you can see already from kind of closer to the turn of the century, we're already getting pretty significant changes and pretty significant alterations to the ecosystem beyond what we're naturally seeing. So to start, I like to kind of break down in terms of a botanical inventory, what do we have around the lake into three kind of distinct ecosystem types that I would mention, which is the marsh, the forest habitat that we can see around, and the bog. So Beaver Lake comprises a large variety of these ecosystems and habitats. It gets about 1.2 meters of rain on average. And that's what allows the supporting of these different types of ecosystems in certain contexts. I'll go over a lot of the plants, but generally you find most of the marsh species very close to the margins of the lake, within the lake itself as it slowly delimnifies or becomes not a lake and transitions into a wetland. You can see, especially in the middle picture there, lots of forest habitat surrounds the lake itself. We'll go over some of those species. And then a pretty novel and unique ecosystem that we have, which I'll be talking about at length, is the bog, which you can see on the right here. So at this time, the bog here, this is a photo from winter. We'll get into some other photos, but quite unique, only one of two within Vancouver itself. So quite rare kind of novel ecosystem. The other thing I'll just shout out, if you're curious while you're out and about going around in Stanley Park, the Ecology Society has a life list, or what we call a life list, which is essentially a comprehensive species inventory. Oh, whoops, sorry. So to date, we've recorded just over 1,000 native species, 20 SAR species, so those are species at risk as designated by the federal government, and then 41 blue or red listed species. So that's a provincial designation of either special concern or endangered, basically animals that we are more rare that we want to keep around. So it's available on our website, and I'd really encourage you, if you're out in the park, you're curious, or even if you're just at home right now, you're curious if, hey, does Stanley Park have this species? You can use our life list. You can see how it's broken down, multiple different subcategories, presence, if it's confirmed, if it was exturbated. A really, really good way to kind of understand the scope of Stanley Park as an ecosystem and the number of actual species and organisms are there, right? Oftentimes when we think of urban parks, we think they're quite disturbed. We think we're not actually seeing a lot of species, but Stanley Park has a huge number, right? Over 1,000 native species, as I mentioned. So it's quite impressive. So something to keep in mind. Sure.
Does it indicate where in the park it was seen?
Good question. Not necessarily on the life list, but there are other tools and metrics, some of which we'll pitch later, but I would encourage you to look at iNaturalist. So the question, sorry for the Zoom people, was just, does the life list explain where specifically? Sometimes there's comments about like where it was seen, especially if it was last seen. Like Western painted turtle, I believe, was last seen in the lagoon, Lost Lagoon, in like 2012. And there's comments.
Species includes animals and plants.
Yes, correct. Fungi, all species. You can sort by the categories. Sorry, it's very small font, I know. But you got plants, vertebrates, even slime molds, down to slime molds. So a wide variety. So I'm going to go over a couple of the marsh species to start. So one of the most common ones of the native species that we're going to see will be some of the yellow pond lily. So those are situated throughout the lake, but predominantly more towards the eastern half of the lake itself. And then of course, irises, very common in Vancouver, very common around these kind of marsh ecosystems. This one is quite unique. I'm calling it blue flag iris. There might be some keen people either in here or on Zoom or looking at that or thinking, perhaps it's not northern blue flag, perhaps it's Japanese, perhaps it's an ornamental or a hybrid, very difficult to tell. So apologies in advance if I've misidentified that one. And then bogbean. I really recommend people, if they are in Vancouver, if you come out to Beaver Lake in the summer, or late spring, early summer, you'll see the bogbean spreading, and it's very beautiful in the lake, especially in like the evening time. So those are some of the common species that you'll see within the lake. The yellow pond lily itself, we like to see as it contends with the fragrant water lily that's also within there, and the same goes for the blue flag. So the blue flag is oftentimes considered the native variant of the yellow flag iris, which is an invasive species I'll talk about a little bit later. Just want to go over too, so there's a bunch of other wide variety of species we see. Many types of bulrushes, many flowered bulrushes are incredibly common, different types of juncus that you can see, especially along the margins and drainage sections around the lake. Water horsetail, which is known as equestium as well, super common, and I find it incredibly interesting that we have as like a teaching and education tool. So oftentimes when we're going through the park, we'll use these types of plants as an education perspective, and equestium is a great one because we can talk about how it's been around for, I think, roughly 250 million years. So an incredibly old plant species that's still thriving within the park today. Other things that we might see are different types of sedges. Marsh cinquefoil, if people are familiar, is another common species that you'll notice, as well as European water horehound, which some might consider invasive, some might just consider naturalized. There's a bit of differences. Basically, we kind of look at invasive species from a targeted perspective about how aggressive they are at colonizing, different things like this. So those are, water horehound is kind of lower on our list for sure. We also have forests, as I mentioned, predominantly dominated by western red cedar and hemlock, as well as some Douglas fir. There is an understory as well in different sections containing things like Pacific bleeding heart, which you can see in the middle there, and some red huckleberry. I always like to mention red huckleberry, given the fact that not many people know how slow growing this species is. So if you're looking at a red huckleberry that's about the size of me, 5'10", 178 centimeters for our European friends, probably would take anywhere from like 80 to 100 years to grow that size. So they're incredibly slow growing. And Stanley Park is quite unique in that we can have, individual specimens that are like double the height of me, which gives you an idea of just how old some of those plants themselves are. In recent years, there's been a kind of downturn in the number of Western hemlock. That's predominantly because of the the hemlock looper outbreak, which has occurred over the past few years. I'm sure many of you either have seen within Stanley Park or different areas around Vancouver, those little green caterpillar or inchworm looking guys. So they've done quite a number on the hemlocks, and Stanley Park obviously is full of hemlocks, so it had quite an impact. The understory as well can be limited with forest habitat, and that's predominantly because, as I've mentioned, a large number of visitors go and use Beaver Lake on a daily basis, so soil compaction is a huge problem. So we've actually just done a large number of planting events at Beaver Lake, just north of it, to try to bolster a bit of the understory species. So they're somewhat limited in certain areas, and we're doing our best from a management perspective to assist the Parks Board with kind of bolstering that understory. Other commonly observed species in the forest habitat you might see are Oregon grape, different varieties. I actually learned this when we were planting. So there's dull Oregon grape, very common, and then there's tall Oregon grape. So if you're out and about and you notice the minute differences, the tall, obviously a little bit bigger, a little bit spikier, more woody-like. A wide variety of ferns, so deer ferns, lady ferns, bracken ferns. Another really common species that we really like to see is the three-leaf foam flower. So if you're out and about and walking around, you might notice very, very small white flowers near the trail sides. A great species because it exists along trail sides and does quite well, so it can contend with some of the invasive species. So we're happy to see it there. Salal obviously is very common. Many people know salal. And then of course we have lots of different types of berries, thimbleberry, salmonberry. Another species that I'll note, I don't have a photo of it, but if you're walking around and you see it, it's quite cool, is false azalea. So it's a larger type shrub, similar-ish to elderberry, maybe not quite as big. But there's really not a lot of it throughout the rest of the park, but particularly around Beaver Lake, we actually have quite a large number of individuals there. So something to keep an eye out for when you're walking around the lake. And then of course, my favorite ecosystem that we have around Beaver Lake is the bog. So it's located within the southwestern portion of Beaver Lake. And as I had mentioned, it's one of the two bogs remaining in Vancouver, the other being Camosun Bog, which is in Pacific Spirit Park. Technically, we say bog, and then you'll see bog referenced everywhere, but for the hardcore wetland enthusiasts, you are correct, it's not actually a bog. It's considered a mire, and this is because it's receiving water both from rainwater and the lake itself. So there's going to be some underground filtration into the bog. Technically, it's a mire. Everywhere else, you will see it referenced as a bog. So we're going to continue with that. So there have been studies pertaining to the bog that can date back to at least 1998. A study done by students at the Capilano College identified that the remnants of the bog at that time were part of a larger bog that had previously existed prior to the building of the causeway. This was confirmed in part as well through pollen core samples from the early 90s that support this claim. Obviously, one of the big components that we have to verify that a bog is present is sphagnum moss or peat moss, as the common name suggests. Very important species, is a wide variety of uses, and has led partially to why we only have 2 bogs remaining in Vancouver, is that peat moss is quite sought after, and for a long time it was used in a variety of different materials and sources, and there wasn't really much effort to conserve those things, so we kind of lost a lot of bog habitat as a result. So Spes had known about this kind of historic bog that existed within the lake itself through some of these pollen core samples, and so back at the start of the 2000s, there was kind of an initiative to identify and say, hey, can we do something to restore this bog? So it was quite a long and drawn out experience. In 2010, we released a state of the park report on ecological integrity. I will get into that a little bit later, but essentially it's just a comprehensive report that indicated that the bog was still intact, but at risk of disappearing due to encroachment of small trees and other terrestrial plant species. So in this particular case, this ecosystem is unique in that it's not being overrun solely by invasives, but also by what we consider other native species. So hardhack, other woody kind of stemmy plants have come in. You can kind of see from the photo in 2002 here versus 2012 the differences that we're seeing, right? So in 2012, as we put in tons of peat moss, a lot of that sphagnum looks quite different, right? The arrows that you see can correspond just to show you kind of the extents of the bog that we have currently. So initially, it was about 15 meters by 34 meters and approximately 2 meters deep. So back in 2009, 3 small test patches were developed for restoration purposes, basically to just have us say, hey, is this possible? Is it feasible for us to restore this habitat? And how's that going to work? And then in 2011, the Vancouver Parks Board approved the Ecological Action Plan, which included restoration of the bog. And then in 2012, in consultation with both the Vancouver Parks Board and the Camosun Bog Restoration Group, Spes began restoration of the bog.
So is the restoration included like removing a lot of the Labrador tea and stuff that we saw in that other photo?
So the Labrador tea will have remained for the most part. Some of it might have been removed initially to place the sphagnum down to get that thick sphagnum layer, and then probably was put back while other species were removed. So that's what we'll kind of go over a bit today. So as you can see on the right here, this is a bunch of our volunteers doing our annual bog maintenance, which I'll get into next slide. But as you can see, it looks quite different, right? Lots of that Labrador tea, kind of hard to assess. A wide variety of more bog-like species. So we've established that sphagnum base of that peat moss. The soil has become a lot more acidic. It's very damp, but definitely a more mire bog ecosystem that we have. So we maintain it on an annual basis, as I mentioned, to ensure that separation of those terrestrial species from encroaching in. Some of the key species that we have established or included in there are bog cranberry, the sphagnum moss, which I've already talked extensively about, Labrador tea, one of my favorites, the roundleaf sundew, which is one of BC's only carnivorous plant species, which I always find interesting. Whenever I think about carnivorous plant species, I'm always thinking about like pitcher plants that are, in the tropics. It's very cool for me to think that here in BC we have our own native variety. And then of course bog laurel. So here are some of these plant species that you can see. So the roundleaf sundew on the right here, one of my favorites, a very unique way for it to capture its prey, so to speak. So it'll have these articulating hairs that come out, this substance, flies will fly onto it, get stuck, they'll move around, thrash around, the sundew will kind of envelop them and digest them. Labrador tea here in the middle, another really interesting species, culturally significant, so used by host nations for many, many years. As the name might suggest, you can turn it into a tea. And then bog cranberry, another one of my favorites, a very slow growing and small plant species that has these really nice berries. One thing I'll note as well about Labrador tea, which is interesting, is that we use it to refer to one species, but really there's three types of different species that are all very, very closely related. So there's Northern Labrador tea, there's bog Labrador tea, and there's Western Labrador tea. And they all virtually look almost identical, so very difficult to tell apart. So as I mentioned, we do this on an annual basis for restoration, and it's a full-time job. So we do annual bog restoration sessions, working with the Camerson Bog Restoration Group. And we do it usually about 4 or 5 sessions per year. The reason why it's so limited and so targeted is because the bog is really, really sensitive, right? When we're walking along that peat moss, you can imagine you're getting about 2 meters, maybe 3 meters of peat moss. You're working in there, it's not like another ecosystem where it can kind of tolerate a lot of abuse or a lot of numbers of people walking over it. So it's quite limited, it's quite targeted. And the purposes of doing that is, as I mentioned, to maintain that existing restoration area. So each year we go in there, we remove as much of the non-bog species as we can, focus on maintaining the existing bog species and preventing establishment of those non-bog terrestrial plants. So hardhack, a great species, we love to see it around the lake. It will also come into the bog and we will be removing it. We do our best to try to replant where possible, but there's a quite healthy population of most of these terrestrial plants around the lake itself, so we're not overly worried by removing them from this patch. And we do this primarily in August and early September because this is essentially the only time we can access the bog. Outside of this, currently right now, it'll be flooded. You'd have to go in there with chest waders. You wouldn't be able to see anything. So it's a pretty limited and small window that we have. So it's really important that we always consider in stewardship to these windows of time that we can work and kind of balancing, preventing the establishment of the species we're not looking for, while maintaining the balance of a delicate ecosystem. And the bog, I think, is a really unique opportunity for us to kind of understand how to do that. I also just want to mention, I know that the focus today was primarily on botany, but there is a wide variety of different types of species that inhabit Beaver Lake. On the far left there, I found this within the bog this summer. It's Hygrocybe miniata, which is vermilion waxcap, I think is the common name. But the point being, lots of unique mushroom species all around the lake. It's a great place, especially in the fall. Maybe still now, you might have a couple more weeks before it gets really, really frosty and we don't see much. But I really recommend, if you're a fungi enthusiast, to check it out around Beaver Lake. There's some very cool species. The beavers, of course, which I'll talk about briefly now. So you're probably thinking Beaver Lake, just haven't even talked about it yet. They came at the turn of the century. Prior to this, Beaver Lake was just referred to as the lake or the pond. So the beavers established. People aren't really sure exactly how. So when you think about Stanley Park, where it's situated, the thought that a beaver would be crossing the Burrard Inlet or coming in is kind of mysterious, but they're here. And they play a pretty significant role within the Beaver Lake ecosystem as well. Beavers are kind of ecosystem engineers. So for anybody not familiar, essentially the impacts that they have kind of have huge extending impacts onto the ecosystem, right? You can imagine them creating their dams that reduces the amount of water that goes to certain areas, that slows water, that encourages ponded sections, which is helpful for amphibians, all these types of things. So within Beaver Lake itself, they are still around. You can see the Beaver Lodge from the majority of the section, but I'd recommend if you're ever keen to go to Beaver Lake, you can check it out right from the confluence point of the creek. There's a big outflow where you can see very clearly the nice big mound. And it's quite interesting, especially in the evening time, if people are keen to see beavers. Oftentimes, if you go around sunset, especially in the summer, you'll see the beavers busy and hard at work. An outflow was put in an effort to kind of encourage more water flow into Beaver Creek. A bunch of money was spent, installed, and it's a testament to how enduring these species are. This confluence was put in. It was said to be unable to be dammed up. It was installed. The beavers dammed it up. So the Parks Board's constantly fighting with the beavers to prevent the damming up of that confluence. And then, of course, we have lots of different amphibians. Here we have a bullfrog, so notorious invasive amphibian species. But the much more elusive, but very happy that we have it, is the Pacific chorus frog or Pacific tree frog. So Beaver Lake also supports habitat for that species, which is great to see. And yeah, there's lots of other species around as well. A number of birds. It's not uncommon that if you're out and about Beaver Lake to see a blue heron flying around. There's eagles, bald eagles that are nearby. There's a nest actually located right off Pipeline Road. So if you're into birding as well, a number of different species that will utilize Beaver Lake. So now we'll talk about some of the challenges that are facing the lake. So from the photo you can see here, this is looking, this would be looking north into the lake. What you're seeing here is the lake itself. So this is giving you an idea of the extent of the vegetation matting and the loss of water that's occurring. All of this area here should essentially be lake, but has become a connected floating vegetation island that is now drowned out the lake in much of the portions. So the bog bean, which is littered along most of this, is doing quite well here as a wetland marsh species, but the lake itself is kind of quickly disappearing. One of the main challenges, obviously, invasive species. So as I mentioned, that fragrant water lily has done quite a number on Beaver Lake. Other species, which we'll go over shortly, include purple loosestrife, yellow flag iris. All these things contribute to the formation of these vegetation islands within Beaver Lake, and they basically speed up this process of succession, of turning the lake into a wetland. Delignification, as I mentioned, the lake is drying up. So that's a consequence of most of these other ecological challenges, but I list it separately because addressing that is an issue in and of itself. How do we deal with the fact that the lake is no longer becoming a lake? And then a lack of freshwater input. So there's been quite a disruption of the hydrology, as you mentioned, or as I mentioned, sorry. Back at the turn of the century when the causeway was built, that cut the watershed in half. So that already had a huge impact on the water flow coming into the park. But since then, there have been a lot of developments that have further reduced the freshwater inputs into the lake. So for instance, your question about North Creek, does it feed into Beaver Lake? It does, it's true, but for much of the year, it's completely dry. So it's not a significant source of water to Beaver Lake. So that's a big challenge. And then poor water quality. So again, this is kind of an offset of the fact that we have this lake in an urban park. It's surrounded by roadways, it's surrounded by trails. This causes excess inorganic nutrient build up elevated concentrations of heavy metals and things like this. So there was actually a study done back in 1984 by Hatfield Consultants that estimated the lake would fully disappear by 2020. So the fact that it's still hanging on is, I guess, a testament to the lake itself, but that gives you an idea of kind of the speed which we anticipate Beaver Lake to be, well, not a lake anymore. We've done studies that have anticipated that there's 1.63 centimeters of sediment accumulation per year. So 1.36 centimeters within the bottom of the lake. The lake itself isn't incredibly deep, maybe 2 meters at some portions. So you can imagine how much of an impact that has year to year. One of the main issues as well, from a community ecology perspective, is that the water has been studied by multiple different researchers and was noted to be too warm and have too low of a dissolved oxygen content. So for those who aren't familiar, fish do really well when we have high oxygen in the water, who would have guessed, and when the temperature is a suitable level for them to survive. So especially in the summer months when it gets very, very hot, this makes it a barrier for fish essentially to be able to survive. So that's partially the reason why many types of fish species cannot survive in Beaver Lake. There have been records and reports of coastal cutthroat trout back in like 2012, 2014. We haven't seen any since. It's common to see three-spined stickleback, which are these really small species. Up until 2014 or 2016, they weren't even classified as a fish by the provincial government because they're so numerous and they can survive in many, many, many conditions. So that just gives you an idea of the fact that only the hardiest of hardy fish species are able to survive in the lake right now currently. Another problem is that previously Beaver Lake was receiving water from a multitude of sources, but essentially due to the demands of the city itself, that municipal drinking water, which previously had been going to Beaver Lake, has had to be diverted since then. I'm not exactly sure the date specifically, but even as close as 2012 to 2014, I believe, some of that water has had to be diverted. So that's part of the reason why you're also seeing this progression. This photo gives you a really good idea. Particularly this year, I noticed how dry it was. I'm literally standing on the lake right now, just past the bog, essentially in the middle of the lake. So that gives you an idea of how much sediment's accumulated and how little water there is. So all of these factors have a significant impact on influencing the lake. The other thing I'll mention, I briefly talked about it, but the fact that there's these trails around the park is great, right? It adds to accessibility. It allows people to enjoy nature, to go around the park. But one of the challenges from that is that you get inorganic sediment deposition into the lake. So that speeds up, obviously, the more that's being pushed into the lake, it speeds up that process of adding sediment layers and minimizing the amount of water that's present. So this photo, which was taken from the city of Vancouver, does a great job of kind of showing you the impact, particularly of those water lilies and those other invasive species, on the spread of these vegetation islands. So in the top left here in 1969, you can see only really kind of small number of sections are really, really impacted particularly. And that as we go throughout the years, you notice and you can see the spread. Of particular note as well is when the islands kind of connect and attach with each other. That's where you get these huge masses that form, and that really speeds up that delimnifying process. So they contribute a ton to the rapid infilling of the lake. Another particular problem which exacerbates water quality issues is the fact that these water lily especially suck up a lot of the oxygen from the lake itself. So they're the ones that are utilizing some of that oxygen, and they're inputting a lot of excess nutrients. So there have been studies that have done which have indicated potentially, along with the water lilies, other bacterial problems that might be speeding up this process and this worsening of water quality. And so the outcome, essentially, of this is over time, as the vegetation builds up and reduces lake depth, it leads to this swamp formation. So we get a shift of the ecosystem from a more lake ecosystem into this swamp, and then eventually over time it gets overtaken.
Can you show us on there where the bog is, or does
Sure.
it not show?
It doesn't show specifically, but for people's reference, the bog is in this other section here. It's relatively removed and it is in the kind of a drier portion of the lake itself, so it's quite disconnected. And one of the things that the bog has going for it is the fact that it is surrounded by some of those terrestrial species, so it actually acts as kind of like a nice barrier in a way, making sure that the bog remains. But of course, you need sufficient water supply still to be supplied to the bog in order for it to exist.
Oh, just for the people in Zoom land, your
Yes, sure.
Your pointer, your mouse pointer can be seen.
Oh, I don't know where my pointer went. But if you're looking on Zoom, if you look to the south of the maps, that's where the bog is kind of located. It's very hard to see in these photos, but we can go back over and I can highlight it in another map. But I do want to say that delimnification, as it's so to speak, or the turning of the lake into a swamp, is a natural process. So this diagram does a nice job of kind of showing us how that occurs. You've probably already kind of ascertained it from what I've said. But essentially, when you have these open bodies of water, mostly stagnant water, naturally what will happen is you'll get these floating vegetation mats of different species. That'll start causing sediment infilling, organic layers will form. Over time, that open water area becomes smaller and gets more infilled. The vegetation continues to aggressively grow. It decomposes, changes the water quality characteristics of the lagoon, further enhances that process. And you can eventually get to a point where, yeah, you get, after many years, the lake is completely converted. So full conversion to forest habitat will take quite a significant amount of time. Obviously, as I mentioned, they anticipate that the lake was gone by 2020. It's still here. So it's a slow process, but it is something that's continually occurring on a large time scale, and it can feel rapid in the sense of when we're looking at the lake year to year, you can see quite a diminishing, and the water depth can feel quite diminished.
Is the bog declining as well? The lake is declining and the bog is declining?
No. So the nice thing is because we're able to get in every year for the annual bog maintenance, sorry, for the Zoom people, yeah, for the Zoom people, the question was, is the bog also decreasing? And the answer to that is no, it's actually being maintained. And part of that is because we're able to go in there with volunteers on a yearly basis and kind of maintain that size. But outside of the existing restored patch, the bog isn't growing. So essentially what we've done is helped, preserve what ecosystem remained of that bog, and we're maintaining that. Initially, when it was done, they literally put down some type of geotextile or some type of matting, and that was what outlined the bog, based off the characteristics of those studies that we'd seen, right? So the soil needs to be relatively acidic, but those dimensions were probably developed as a result of some of those studies. Okay, where is the soil characteristics most prominent and sufficient for a bog versus not? So here's a photo of the fragrant water lily. It's known by many names: Eurasian water lily, multitudes of different names, but Nymphaea odorata. It's incredibly beautiful. So it was introduced back in 1936 to commemorate the city of Vancouver's 50th anniversary. So like many invasive species, we unfortunately put it here thinking this will be great. And it slowly colonized the majority of the lake. One of the main issues, obviously, is that its stems and roots contribute to that infilling that I mentioned by creating these vegetation mats. So because the lake itself is not very deep, what ends up happening is these roots will shoot down into these organic layers. They will grow, they will decompose, create sediment layers that build up, and then you get these patches. There was a study done in 2014 that estimated 78% of the lake was currently covered by the fragrant water lily. Now, I would hazard a guess, it's probably closer to about 80–85%. So when you put that in context, it's quite a large impact that this one particular species has had on influencing the lake.
So, just a simple question. All the leaves of the lilies prevents light, right?
Yes. Yeah. So the question was, does the invasive water lily prevent kind of light seeping in, and how does that impact it? And yeah, it definitely does. So that creates different characteristics for the water, and it also creates these stagnant sections that heat up much faster because it's so stagnant and there's no flow. So that's one of the main concerns, and also for the fact that that material kind of edges out anything else that could potentially be growing there, right? So the lily does such a great job at covering a wide area. That yellow pond lily, which I talked about, which actually we like to have, has a harder time establishing, right? Because those invasive ones just spread so much quicker, and they create these dense mats that the yellow pond lily, when its roots try to come up, it can't come up. So that's
they turn pink.
Yes, so they can have a wide variety. I've seen anywhere from like white, slightly purplish, pinkish, to bluish, depending on like the variety. And I think that's just some plasticity in their phenotype. So basically just how their genes express color. But yeah, so they're very beautiful, which is the difficult thing. If you go at a particular time of year, especially like May, it is very beautiful on the lake, but it's kind of like a deadly beauty, so to speak. So there's some other species of concern that I want to highlight because they're very common, and it's a problem that we deal with in Stanley Park, but also around BC. So one of the main offenders we have is yellow flag iris, which you can see on the left here. Again, very beautiful, but a very aggressive invasive species. So it comes in, and you can see it in the background of the photo there, how quickly it creates these monocultures. So that's one of the main concerns that we have with invasive species. Is essentially they come in, they colonize an area, they outcompete all the native species, and you get a reduction in biodiversity. This is difficult because obviously biodiversity helps bolster other biodiversity. So if we only have one plant species, that limits the number of insects, butterflies, flies, other types of things that can come in and pollinate and kind of maintain a sufficient level of biodiversity. Purple loosestrife is another big offender, and it's a more recent offender that we've noticed within the park. Part of the reason it's so difficult to control as well is that one plant can produce, I think, like 1 million seeds or something like that. So you can imagine as a semi-aquatic invasive producing that number of seeds, those go into a water system. You can see how very quickly this plant can spread, right? If it got near the confluence of the creek, or if it got into different watersheds, the water takes it, spreads it all over the place. Very, very difficult to control and maintain. And then Himalayan blackberry, I always mention because Himalayan blackberry is always a problem. Beaver Lake not included. So there's some sections around Beaver Lake that have become dominated by this Himalayan blackberry, and that particularly impacts the forested sections. It helps contribute to that reduction in the shrub understory that we kind of want to promote. And it's also limiting for a lot of bird species. So I always say Himalayan blackberry, while it looks pretty, it really reduces the number of songbirds that are able to nest in it. I think essentially only American robin and spotted tuis can make nests in Himalayan blackberry, versus having a more diverse understory allows for a lot of different other bird species to not only utilize it for nesting, but also for feeding and foraging purposes. So another challenge, the water allocation that I mentioned briefly. Because of that disruption of the watershed, there's limited groundwater input into the lake. So part of the reason why we are seeing such drastic changes, especially more recently, is the fact that, as I mentioned, the lake has had to contend with like essentially a half reduction in groundwater seepage into it. There is potential, and I'll talk about some of the solutions. Don't worry, it's not all dreary. But that's a current consideration right now, is how do we get more groundwater upwelling into the lake itself to provide sufficient fresh water to continue the lake to as an ecosystem to exist. And as I mentioned, the fact that the municipal water that was previously being supplied to the lake no longer is. So this causes a challenge for us. How do we deal with it? Sediment characteristics and water quality. I'll go over this briefly because we've kind of already talked about it, but the lake is becoming acidic. Studies done by the Beaver Lake Enhancement Plan and the qualified environmental professionals who did that conducted that there was a pH of about 5.4 to 5.93. So for everybody, neutral is 7. So that's quite acidic for a lake. And part of that is from those water lilies and that decaying organic matter, and potentially some bacterial activity. There's also some issues in regards to exceedances of heavy metals. So cadmium, copper, and iron were noted to be elevated within the water itself within the lake. And then zinc, copper, cadmium were elevated within sediment samples. So they do core sampling of those organic layers, and they noted some exceedances. The exceedances are based off standards set by either the federal government or the provincial government, different regulatory bodies, and there's different levels. The photo that you're seeing to the left here, so for everybody on Zoom, I'm sorry it's small, essentially shows the sample locations that they took and where exceedances were noted. So if you see red, you're getting no exceedances. If you're seeing orange, you're getting exceedances of at least 1 compared to the CSR and CCME, which I will list for you right now for those.
So exceedances is the heavy metals?
Sorry?
What is being exceeded, the heavy metal?
Yes, the heavy
levels?
metal concentrations. So the amount of heavy metal is actually located within either the water or the sediment. So the yellow and orange are really what we're looking at here. So you can see of the samples they did, quite a large portion of them had exceedances. Another issue was that the testing of the floating vegetation islands revealed excess arsenic, cadmium, copper, lead, mercury, and zinc, those fine heavy metals. So that likely suggests that that water lily is sequestering the heavy metals into the lake. So a lot of plant species actually help uptake heavy metals out of a system. Bulrushes or cattails are particularly good at this. They're often used in remediation to pull heavy metals out, but it seems like the invasive lily is actually sequestering or pushing those heavy metals back out. So obviously a challenge and a problem. So now you're probably sitting here going, great, there's a lot of issues going on with Beaver Lake. What do we do about it? This is a question that has been asked very frequently, and it's been the subject of a ton of study. So some key steps that have been taken already are the development of various management plans and enhancement plans. So I would encourage you, if you're very curious, you can find these all online. The Parks Board website essentially hosts all of these, and they detail in great length what steps could be taken to improve. These include the Forest Management Plan, the Ecological Action Plan, and then specifically the Beaver Lake Enhancement Plan. I'll also pitch the SOPI reports. Those are the State of the Park for Ecological Integrity reports that SPES does. I'll talk about those shortly. And there's some aims and goals that we need to think about when we want to say, how can we address this issue and how can we enhance the habitat? We want to think about maximizing biodiversity, maintaining the site character, and then preserving the ecosystem. So much of these reports that I mentioned, obviously I'm not going to go over all of them in this short presentation, well, semi-short presentation with you, but the focus is essentially on, maximizing biodiversity, establishing a nice habitat mosaic, so complexity within the ecosystem, preventing the spread of invasive species, ensuring we understand the minimum maintenance requirements, so the amount of fresh water that needs to be brought into the system to maintain to a certain level. And then another key component is utilizing plants of ethnobotanical relevance. So again, as I mentioned, a lot of these worst offenders are the invasive species, and much of this way that we can bolster against those is by incorporating native species, in particular the species that we know belong in the park. And who better to tell us that than the people that have been living there from time immemorial. So I think the role of indigenous knowledge holders in ethnobotany is becoming a more increasing a trend that we're seeing, and I think it's very promising. So the reports, I'll go over briefly. These are what we contribute as our kind of main function to the Parks Board in terms of our recommendations and our understanding of the park. So these reports came about since 2006, the windstorm that occurred in 2006, and we wanted to do an inventory and say, okay, how is the park doing? That had a huge impact. We lost, I think 20 to 40% tree cover in the park. It led to widespread establishment of invasives. So we created this State of the Park report. You can see some of the species that we've identified through our life list that I mentioned. And it helps us kind of understand the big picture of what's going on in the park. So when we look specifically, we ranked each of the ecosystems based off different indicators and then the trends. So we have the status that you can see along the top, good, fair, poor, or not rated, and then the trends. So within that status, what are we noticing? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Is it stable? Or do we not have enough information? And I'll just highlight for you, if you look especially to the freshwater ecosystems, you can see it's considered fair, but not doing so hot. And in particular, when we focus on Beaver Lake, there's a lot of challenges when we look to terrestrial ecosystems. In terms of tree cover of the whole park, it's great, but when we actually zoom in on Beaver Lake itself, we notice there are some challenges. So are there some opportunities specifically with relation to water allocation? So the red dots on this map here represent existing culverts around the lake. So there are potential options to return to diverting water towards the lake. You can see that there's quite a number of options in terms of inputting water, which can either feed into the tributaries, North Creek, or the different creek systems into the lake itself. So the effective goal needs to address the addition of alternate water sources. That's the big concern, right? As the city continues to grow, rightly so, a lot of people might question and say, hey, why are we using clean, fresh drinking water to supply Beaver Lake when it needs to go to people? So there's other options. Yes?
I was just thinking that city water would be chlorinated water, wouldn't it?
Correct.
Is that good for the, well,
No, there are ways. So the question was, is the city water chlorinated? Generally, when they're releasing a large amount, there are methods around it. So you can use things like dechlorination pucks, which is like some type of thiosulfide. I'm not exactly sure, but basically there's ways to pull the chlorine out of the water or reduce it to a sufficient level that it's not having a big impact. But the other options that you can consider too for something like Beaver Lake is the potential of gray water. So gray water might be water that's not potable for human standards, but can still be a sufficient source of water for these lake ecosystems. So one of the other main methods could be enlarging vernal ponds around the lake. So around the lake itself, we currently have these kind of microhabitats of these little wetlands that supply some water to the lake. So there's one thought that perhaps a way to address the water quality concerns is to enlarge these ponds that exist around the lake, kind of along these outskirts, especially in the southern forested areas near the bog, make them bigger so that during the summer months when we have less rain, those bigger vernal ponds can supply more of the water to the lake itself. You can also increase bioinfiltration capacity. So that would mean improved stormwater storage and detention ponds. So there are sections, especially to the south of Beaver Lake itself, there's a large ponded area in the forested section. So you can't particularly see it, but if you look on the kind of close to where I put the photo credit on here, there is a kind of drainage area. Potentially you could use that as a means to bolster water sequestration into the lake. So these are things we have to think about. You know, what barriers are there to storm water or surface water from rain getting into the lake? That's where some of these culverts can help. You can collect water at different points and bring it in. You can also implement water supply management systems to monitor water levels. I think this should be done anyways, but essentially this will help you get a very accurate understanding of what the water levels are looking at and when perhaps you need to turn municipal water sources on and when you don't need to and when you can actually turn it off. So that might be one method. If we're reincorporating municipal water supply to say, hey, we understand that we don't want to be wasting water. If we implement a system like that, we can kind of limit how much water we're constantly pushing into it. And then again, just seeking additional groundwater sources. So there is the potential that we can look in the watershed itself and do various studies to see where might we find underground aquifers or potential sources of groundwater upwelling, make some ponds, some vernal ponds, maybe around the lake itself, and basically feed that into the lake. As far as invasive species management goes, we want to prioritize new and emerging invasives. So there's some species like the fragrant water lily that is just so strongly established that a better use of our time can be to prevent further new invasive species from establishing. So that's part of what we do when we look at invasive species. We say, okay, what's feasible, what's practical, and what approach do we want to take? So of course, any new species we want to control as best we can and eradicate. The more existing species, it now changes to more of a long-term management. How can we limit their impacts? So one of the ways we do that, for instance, when we look at yellow flag iris, which spreads very commonly, we'll cut the seed pods or the flowers off around the lake. So that might not actually be removing some of the material, but we're actually preventing it from spreading further. Spes is lucky in this respect that we have a ton of volunteers. I think we have about 150 regular full-time volunteers that come out on a weekly basis. We've, I think this year alone, done upwards of like 7,000 total volunteer hours across both participants and like private groupings, as well as our weekly dirt sessions and different events. So you can see we have that to our advantage. Another big component that's often talked about is dredging those vegetation islands where it's feasible. So very, very expensive, obviously, and that's partly why it hasn't been done yet and implemented, but dredging these islands would have a huge impact on removing some of those sediment layers and also taking those vegetation islands completely out. And then, of course, we want to replant where we can. So part of the reason, if we can bolster the number of native species around the margins of the lake, or even in some of the existing vegetation islands, it prevents the encroachment of those invasive species from coming back in. So the more resilient species that we can plant, the better chance we have of preventing establishment of these invasives. So I'm just going to highlight a couple different concepts that have been proposed in the past. All of these concepts are from the Beaver Lake Enhancement Plan you can find online, but it's been thought about a lot. The city, the Parks Board, different types of engineers, consultants have really thought about how best can we enhance Beaver Lake. So one of the first concepts I'll highlight is maintaining the islands and viewing platforms. So this approach, the strength of it essentially is that we have the highest increase in plant and animal diversity and overall increase in habitat for various species, deeper water sections through some of that dredging that prevents recolonization of the lilies. So if we go greater than 5 meters in depth, those lilies cannot then grow their roots down far enough to establish. So that solves the problem. The caveat again being that dredging more than 5 meters over a wide area is very expensive and very time consuming, and from a management perspective or from a practical perspective of even how you get a big enough machine in there, very, very difficult. Some of the other things that this concept promotes, obviously that vernal pond integration I was talking about, enhancing of the creek, so that might involve some riparian planting, increasing complexity in the creeks, removing some of the invasives, and then of course managing that within a park context and getting people out into the park, right? I think the biggest thing is advocates of the park or advocates of any natural system, you have to be able to be there to see it or have the ability to see it in order to feel passionate about it and understand what's going on. So the addition of boardwalks and viewing platforms, I think, help balance that the human use that we want along with minimizing the impact. Another approach would be an open water and floating boardwalk. So perhaps we can, spend most of our effort on completely dredging as much as possible, putting in a floating boardwalk and removing those islands completely. Again, the limitation of this approach, you're not getting quite as much diversity since we're totally removing those islands, but you're really preventing the establishment of that lily if you do so. Again, the caveat being dredging of that size and that extent, incredibly, incredibly costly, incredibly time consuming. The floating boardwalk is an interesting idea. It's been done in different places. I don't know if people have ever been up to like White Pine Beach or Sassmat Lake. They have a partial floating boardwalk. People seem to like it. Good opportunity to view nature. There could be just entirely open water and a view tower, which maintains a lot of this existing vegetation island. So essentially reducing the scope, saying we're just going to spend everything to completely remove any material, make it a very deep lake. In a smaller context, we'll put a viewing tower in. And then the last could be a combination of certain things. So some islands, creation of new habitat islands with just native species, deeper channels for fish passage. So saying, okay, let's focus primarily on just opening up some of those existing channels, most of which are made and maintained by the beavers in this system. So if you're ever out at Stanley Park, at Beaver Lake, you'll kind of notice some sections that there are no water lily. That's probably where the beavers are most active and are moving around, and you'll actually notice little channels that cut through, and the beavers are maintaining those. So they're helpful in certain contexts as well. The point of showing you all those was basically there's multitudes of different approaches you can take towards advancement, and a lot of which can vary depending on our goals and what we want to focus on in terms of strengths, as well as understanding some weaknesses of each approach. So SPES's role, I know I'm at an hour now, I'll speed up a little bit here. We focus mostly on research, education, monitoring, and stewardship. So the photo you can see on the right here was from a recent planting event we actually just did, where we were bolstering some of those understory species that we need, that I was telling you about. So we do lots of education programs within the park, and then in terms of a botanical perspective, our stewardship activities. So if you're ever keen to come out, all of our information is on our website. We do a lot of hands-on work, different types of things. We work very closely with a lot of academic institutions as well. So we'll have student groups, master's students out in the park all the time, helping us develop these reports, all of which goes under the framework of that joint operating agreement with the Parks Board, of which we then convey our recommendations to them. And they culminate usually in those state of the park reports. So every decade we release one of those reports. So one was just released for 2020. The upcoming one obviously will be for 2030. So there's always new management challenges and kind of next steps of what we can do. So climate change, we're really realizing, especially as we continue forward, it has another large impact on the lake. So it shifts timelines, essentially, is what it does. As we continue to deal with the impacts of climate change, these timelines of how we want to restore things, enhance things, change. I think there's also a big need to incorporate Indigenous decision-making into the process. This is something that wasn't talked about as frequently even just 10 years ago, that I think in recent years has really taken like the center and the stage. And I think that's super important, right? Because the Indigenous groups, the host nations that have lived in these areas, often beyond having a claim to the land, also I think have a ton of knowledge about how we can help restore it, right? They have the understanding of what it looked like, what types of species are useful, all these types of things. So I think that's another challenge in a good sense that's being incorporated now, is how do we include Indigenous perspectives into these types of management approaches. And then of course the big question is, how do you implement management? So again, I only work for SPES, I'm not going to talk on behalf of the Parks Board, and I understand that there's plenty of difficulties with any municipality or city, but the big question is, okay, how do you go about and implement it? And I think part of what we want to do too is provide education so that people can be keen about it, right? The Parks Board is elected, city officials are elected, and so they go off a mandate of what people want to see, right? And so the more people that are concerned about these issues, the more people that are passionate about it, then it becomes more of a forefront issue that gets brought up more frequently. This is an example too of that beaver dam that you can see. So that's what it looks like. This is a fun little initiative. And then there's two main theories. This is another big challenge in recent years. It's become kind of evident to some ecologists, to some management, you know, what do we do? Do we return the Beaver Lake itself to a wetland or marsh? So do we just say, okay, we're dealing with an inordinate amount of cost to restore Beaver Lake to a lake ecosystem. This is a natural process anyways. Why don't we just let Beaver Lake become a marsh? Why don't we focus all our efforts perhaps on invasive species removal, and we just let nature be nature? Other people say, no, we want to maintain it as a lake. It has utility as a lake. We'd like to eventually see fish return, all these other things. I'm not here to tell you which one is correct or which one is not. They, again, like anything, they both have positive, negative components. And I think that's the biggest challenge, especially in recent years, is deciding like, what is it that we want to achieve and how do we want to achieve it and at what cost? You can see obviously the photo on the right here, Beaver Lake looking much more like a lake. So you compare that to one of the earlier photos I showed you and you might be thinking, wow, okay, it's extensively different. So where do we put our money? And that's the big approach too with ecology, and that's the challenge with any type of restoration work, is what's practical and what's feasible, right? We can oftentimes come up with really fancy enhancement initiatives, but at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves what makes the most sense. Balancing biodiversity preservation, balancing maintaining ecosystems with cost.
Do you have a date for that photo on the right?
I don't know off the top of my head, but it comes from the archives, so I would imagine like early 1900s. And yeah, that concludes my presentation. I'll open it up to questions now. Yeah, thank you for listening.
And Peter asked, you were talking about climate change. How climate change how are climate change effects being factored into management and conservation of the ecosystem at Beaver Lake?
Very good question. So again, I just want to reiterate, I do not work for the Parks Board. So they are the ones in charge of essentially management, and we provide recommendations. So on that note, what I can basically say is it's definitely being incorporated. I think the shifting of timelines is the biggest one, and understanding like how long it takes. Another big component is, like I said, with restoration, the resilience, right? We want to maintain ecosystems that are very resilient. We see it even now with like the hemlock looper, right? So many of the trees are in the process of being removed within Stanley Park that are dead. So obviously one of the main things we need to think about is, okay, how do we replace the trees that are lost? If we just simply put back strands of monocultures of hemlock, we're not really addressing the problem. And in fact, hemlock aren't doing so hot because of the drought anyways. We need to be thinking about other species. So one of the ways it's changed, for instance, is the species that go in. Different types of spruce, different types of other trees. Perhaps we use different species as a whole.
And do we have questions from the audience?
Yes. I'm very impressed by the number of volunteers that you mentioned. That blew me away. You know, but volunteers need to be managed. Is it managed by SPECH or the Parks Board or a combination of both?
The volunteers that we have are specifically managed by SPES. And so a lot of, like I said, I mentioned, we have about 150 stewardship volunteers that come on a routine basis. So either through our dirt sessions during the week or on the weekend. Oftentimes, especially in recent years, I think from what I've heard anyways, it's been very nice to see we have quite a variety of people coming. We have students all the way up to seniors who are retired and everything else in between. A lot of West End residents who live nearby, who are constantly in the park. So that's, I think, one of the big positives and big takeaways that I have is often when we're dealing with stewardship, especially, it can feel really daunting. You know, you're dealing with some species that are just so well established, but it really, I think, makes an impact when you can get that number of people into the park. And then we can have discernible improvements. Like I said, we're on track to put in 1,700 plants this year in the ground, right? And native planting isn't the only thing, but it's a good.
Around the park as a whole, or what?
Yeah, they're targeted planting sites, but just this year alone, we're putting in about 1,700.
Throughout the park.
Yeah, and the locations. Yeah, this year particularly it was around Beaver Lake, but it's based off our kind of approaches to where we feel it's necessary. Luckily, too, Stanley Park is healthy enough that there are sections where when we clear invasives, there are enough native species present that they can actually recolonize the area, and we don't see invasives. Usually where we plant is where there needs to be additional help. So for instance, at the Beaver Lake site that we were planting at, it had been very compacted for people, you know, going off trail, standing on it, having picnics, sitting down. So we went in there, loosened up the soil, put a bunch of plants in. Yes.
So how many employees are there on the SPEC spec?
Good question. So the question was, how many employees are there at SPES? I think it oscillates, but anywhere from like 12 to 16. So there's some temporary staff in the summer, but it's a very small team. And so we really rely on our volunteers to get a lot of our work done.
Where does your pay come from?
A bunch of different sources. So a lot of which comes from the Vancouver Parks Board, and then a lot of our funding comes from grant sources. So we seek different types of grants. In terms of stewardship as well, we do a lot of programming. So we'll have a lot of corporate and non-corporate groups that will come, pay a program fee, and then come help us do invasive removal, either as like a corporate initiative or different things like that.
I had a question about the Pacific chorus frogs.
Sure.
And the bullfrogs.
Yeah.
Do you find that the population of Pacific chorus frogs is sort of healthy, stable, even with the bullfrogs? I'm curious because in our neighborhood, Everett Crowley Park, 30 years ago, there was tons of Pacific chorus frogs and very few bullfrogs. And now it's very rare to hear a chorus frog, and there's lots of bullfrogs. And I've always kind of assumed that the bullfrogs ate a lot of the, chorus frog eggs and young and stuff, and that they had kind of displaced them. But now I'm also wondering whether it might be sort of other habitat changes that meant that the habitat was less good for the chorus frog and better for the bullfrog. So I'm just wondering, do you find that there's kind of managing to both the chorus frogs are doing okay despite there being bullfrogs?
Sure. Okay, so big question. Anecdotally, I can say I still hear chorus frogs fairly regularly, which is good. The limitation, like I mentioned, with a small nonprofit is that our capacity to do some of those studies sometimes is limited. So we do our best to monitor. We do like marsh playback calls and monitoring. So we'll go out and we'll listen and we'll see what we can hear. That obviously is not a stand-in for estimating population size, but it at least lets us determine occupancy. Are they still there? But you're right, bullfrogs being invasive have a huge impact on a lot of native frog species. And there's also green frog and Beaver Lake, so those definitely will probably play a role in reducing the number. I don't know off the top of my head what the population metrics are looking like for Pacific chorus frog. Would be a great student project. So that's kind of where we, take those ideas and think like, how can we implement them within our current framework? So the short answer is I don't know exactly, but anecdotally speaking, we still hear them, and we still hear them relatively frequently, which is a good sign. It also could be the fact that Beaver Lake is big enough that it can still support a population of Pacific Forest frog, right? Like the chorus frog can potentially lay eggs in spots that might be a little bit more difficult for the bullfrog to get to, or just the sheer number. It's hard to say. But if I hazard it, like, it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that it's probably declining as well. I'm just hesitant to say that because we haven't done a ton of research specifically on that.
Thank you.
Any other final questions?
Very impressive presentation, so much information.
Oh, thank you.
Obviously a lot of work.
I did my best. Now you're all Beaver Lake experts.
Yes, so if we could give a really good round of applause to Dacyn.
Thank you.